for joining us today, and welcome to the 2011 California Preservation Foundation webinar series. And today we'll be discussing the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. And before we get started, we're going to have a question and answer period at the end of the presentations. But if you have any question at any time, please write it in the chat box, and you can send it to the organizer, and I am the organizer. And at the end of the presentation, we will try to answer as many of the questions as possible. Just so everybody knows, all the attendees, you will be on mute throughout the presentation. So if you have any background noise, we won't need to worry about that. We won't be able to catch it. But again, if you have a question, please write it in the chat box. And then also, in regards to today's webinar, after the webinar, you'll receive an electronic version of the presentation and the link to a recorded copy of the webinar. And now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Becky Urbano. And Becky manages Garibaldi's Architecture Incorporated Preservation Services Department. And there she her work includes historic structure reports, resource evaluation, material analysis, and the Secretary of Interior Standards reviews and historic context statements. Becky exceeds the Secretary of Interior's professional standards for architectural history and is also listed as a qualified architectural historian with the California Historical Resources Information System and with the Nevada SHPO. Additionally, she is a Conservation Assessment Program Assessor and is a qualified conservator. Her background in preservation includes materials investigation and historic documentation and research. Becky has a Master's of Science in Historic Preservation from Columbia University and also has a Bachelor of Arts in Physics from Millbury College with departmental honors. And with that, I will hand it over to Becky, today's presenter.
All right, well, welcome everyone. I'm glad you could join us this afternoon. And today we're going to be covering a lot of material. The Secretary for the Interior Standards for the Treatment of Historic Properties is our subject today. The treatments actually have quite a bit of technical language, and hopefully you received a handout or were emailed a handout that has a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation in PDF form that has the technical language for each of the treatments and standards that we are going to discuss today. I'm not going to be dwelling on the technical language so much. I'm trying to give you more layman's terms and practical application. So again, we're going to cover quite a bit of material in a very short amount of time. So if you have questions, please type them in the box, and we will try to answer as many questions at the end of the presentation as possible. But they also will have some resources when you're finished to go through and look at the standards in their actual technical language in more detail should you choose to do so. So with that in mind, let's get started. There we go. Okay, so the standards are actually generic and specific. The Secretary of the Interior standards with a capital S refer to the whole set of philosophical framework that have been developed by the Secretary of the Interior. The standards with a small s are the actual individual components, and we will be presenting as a whole the standards with a capital S and the individual standards with a small s under each treatment. They were developed by the Department of the Interior and specifically by the National Park Service to provide a base for the treatment of historic properties. They were developed around 1976 concurrently with the the federal historic preservation tax program to provide a basis for evaluation that would be somewhat consistent across many different types of projects and across many different geographic locations. Now, the Secretary of the Interior oversees the National Park System, and that also means that the National Register and the National Register and the Federal Tax Credit Program are connected with compliance with the Secretary of the Interior standards. So they are used by national components, the National Park Service and the National Register. They are used by the state, the Historic Preservation Office, and they are used by local governments to guide work on and around historic properties. They were developed about 35 years ago, and they include standards and guidelines. Now, we are going to be covering just the standards. Okay, the guidelines will be found, they can be found online, and they are sort of a more practical application for the standards, and the standards are a little bit more prescriptive. So how do they apply to your project? Well, first of all, depending on where you're getting funding for your project, you may be required to be compliant with the Secretary of the Interior standards. This can be true for different tax credit programs. The federal and some states do have a tax credit program. California, unfortunately, is not one of those, although hopefully that will change in the future. If you hold a Mills Act contract or have various private grants or public grants, you may be required to be compliant with the standards. If you are working on a historic property, your reviewing agency may also require that you are compliant with the standards. That could be a local reviewing agency, a county level, state, or federal, depending on where the jurisdiction lies. And the compliance may be required to maintain your historical status. If you're in a national register, a local listed, or a state listed property, then there are certain environmental review processes, CEQA, NEPA, Section 106, that will require that your project is compliant with the standards. Now, compliance is strongly encouraged and is generally recommended for good building stewards as a way to demonstrate your commitment to recognizing the historical importance of your resource. It also is a very sensitive way to address new design for historic buildings. So just keep in mind that while you might have to comply, as a steward, we hope that you should also want to comply because it generally is the most sensitive way to address historic properties. Now, the standards, again, are the shorthand term for the whole framework, and it's a way of setting up this philosophical framework for dealing with historic properties. There are two components, the standards and the guidelines. The standards are more prescriptive, again, and the guidelines are a little bit more, they are more like case studies. And both are found in a very hefty tome that you can download. I believe it's like 250 pages. Or you can get through the summary sheets, which include just the standards. Now, under the standards, there are actually 4 treatments. Okay, and so this is standards with a capital S. Underneath that, there are 4 different treatments. Okay, the first treatment we're going to talk about today is rehabilitation. Under rehabilitation, there are actually 10 individual standards that are specific to rehabilitation, and those are sort of lowercase standards. Now, rehabilitation as a treatment is generally the most widely used because it allows for new additions and new uses within historic properties. This is the one that when people refer to the standards without any sort of qualifier, most of the time they're referring to rehabilitation. So we are going to concentrate most of our time today on rehabilitation. However, there are 3 others. Preservation has 8 standards that go with it. Now, preservation is what it implies. It is preserving a building. There are very limited changes under preservation, and they usually involve dealing with deferred maintenance or perhaps stabilizing the building while plans are developed for future work or while money is found for future work. But it's really more emergency measures. Restoration is, again, as it implies, to restore a building. It usually has a single time period in mind, and it's very, very specific. It is used more often for interpretive value. So house museums will go for restoration. And there are 10 individual standards that are associated with restoration. And finally, we have reconstruction. There are 6 standards under reconstruction, and as it implies, it is a recreation of a resource or a portion of a resource. Pardon me. Now, documentation is critical for all of these treatments. However, reconstruction is particularly heavily reliant on documentation. Now, you're going to notice as we go through the individual standards for each treatment that there is a lot of repetition. So we're going to present rehabilitation and then compare the different standards under each of the other 3 treatments to rehabilitation. And again, you're going to see that there are some certain underlying themes that keep coming up. One thing that I would like to stress is that terminology here is quite important, and that using the correct term to describe your project shows a level of sophistication and knowledge about historic preservation that is generally expected when you're applying for grants or for review of your project. So what we'd like to see is that the terms are used correctly and that they are applied correctly to any given project. Again, it shows that you have a level of knowledge and sophistication with regards to being a steward for your resource, as well as showing to the grantors or the folks with the money or the folks who are going to be looking at your project that you understand what it is that you're trying to do. So again, you're going to see a lot of repetition. So to kind of cut to the chase, I'm going to break down the standards into 6 points. And these can be true regardless of the treatment. So here are the standards in a nutshell. First of all, choose a use that is appropriate to your building, and try not to shoehorn a use into the building that may require too many changes. Sorry, there's a bit of a delay here. The next one is documentation. Try to avoid conjecture and make sure that you have firm, solid, documented basis for the design decisions that you make. You want to reuse and repair as much of the original material as possible. The idea is that you want an authentic experience that is based on an authentic and true representation of the building. This one's kind of tough. It needs to be differentiated. You can add new elements into a building, but you want to be able to tell that those are not original components of the building. However, you also want to make it compatible. And this is where design really becomes critical and where understanding the nature of your resource becomes critical to find a balance between differentiation and compatibility. Next one is be ready for archaeological finds. Buildings did not exist in isolation. Generally, when you're dealing with very old buildings, they were constructed on areas that were common habitation for people before that particular building was constructed. So you may have prehistorical finds, but also buildings over time will accumulate stuff, and that stuff sometimes makes its way into the ground. So historical archaeology can be very important, and especially if you're dealing with some of the treatments such as reconstruction or restoration, archaeological finds can actually be quite a source of information for your project. And finally, use the gentlest means possible. The idea is to do no harm, or at least do as little harm as possible. Excuse me. Please remember that the standards are a philosophical framework. While they do have individual components, these 6 overarching ideas will be repeated throughout all 4 treatments. And that if nothing else, if you can keep these 6 general philosophies in mind, you're going to be in pretty good shape for being standards compliant. So let's jump right in. First one we're going to look at is rehabilitation. Now, rehabilitation has this very technical definition, but in a nutshell, here's what we're looking at. Rehabilitation, you're allowed to have new uses. You're also allowed to have sensitive additions to a building. This is why this particular treatment is used most often, because it does allow for the most amount of modifications under any of the treatments. However, they have to be balanced, and you still have to do your documentation. But again, for a living, usable building, especially one that is looking at accommodating a new use for a new user, generally changes are going to be desired and warranted. So rehabilitation is the standard that is applied, or the treatment that is applied most often. Excuse me. So we'll look at the first one. Now, the property should be used as it was historically. So sometimes this is easy. You have a building that was a store, it's easy to keep it as a commercial space. Sometimes that's not necessarily true. The picture we have here is a historic train station. Well, we don't use trains quite as often, but there are plenty of other uses that could go into a train station that would be an appropriate use. Things such as commercial space, retail space. The idea is that you want to make the use fit the building rather than the other way around. If you have to make too many modifications to the building in order to accommodate the use, it's probably not the right use for that building, and it may be accommodated more readily in a new structure or in a historic structure with more flexibility. Now, this is not only preservation philosophy, but it also makes economic sense as well. You know, the more material you can reuse and the less impact you have on the building, generally the less expensive it's going to be and the less material you're going to have to invest. Standard 2. Standard 2 is about understanding your resource. You want to know why it is historic, and then try to figure out how that significance is communicated in the built fabric. This requires research, it requires documentation, and it requires looking at the building in a very critical fashion. When we try to figure out how the significance is communicated, those particular features are referred to as character-defining features. And they are not all equal. Depending on why the building is historic, you may find that specific features and spaces within the building have different levels of importance. Some are going to be very critical to understanding how the building functioned or why it's historic, and other elements are not as critical, and those are the areas where you should concentrate your modifications. And you should also realize that it's not always about the aesthetics. You have to understand the relationship between spaces and how those spaces function. The example that we have here is the Immigration Station Hospital on Angel Island. Now, the photograph or the image on the left, you have 2 different colored spaces. The building as originally constructed had 2 different stairwells, and that was because it housed both European immigrants and Asian immigrants. And during an era of segregation, there was a separate entrance and a separate circulation pattern for the Asian immigrants. That's the area represented in red on the left-hand image. The European immigrants had a completely different circulation pattern that was actually more integrated with the actual hospital staff. Over time, the circulation within the building changed, and that circulation pattern was erased. The image that you see on the right-hand side is how the building looks today, with just a single staircase in the middle. Now, the idea of this immigration station hospital functioning during its most significant period of time, when it was an actual immigration station, the idea of the segregation of the two areas is a very critical element of the historical significance of the building and how that's interpreted. So moving forward, as a rehabilitation plan is being developed for this building, the idea of the circulation within the building is a very critical aspect that will have to be incorporated as part of the rehabilitation plan. It's not something that you can necessarily see with the remaining aesthetic features, but again, understanding how the building functioned and why it was significant helps to put in place why this particular non-existing feature now was so critical and why we may want to consider reconstructing that at a later date. Standard 3. Now, this is where you want to be able to read how the building changed over time. You want to be able to take a look and get a sense of how the building developed to get an authentic experience. The idea is not to try to create a false sense of history, but to give an honest assessment of how the building was used and changed by the different people who lived in it. What we can see here is a very modest example of that. And this is a picture of a floor from a 100-year-old residence. The right-hand side of the picture is the original floor, and you can see that there are different pot marks on the floor, and they've all been sanded smooth, but it definitely has a different patina and a slightly different look. What you see on the left-hand side of the image is the new floor. It's the same species, and it has roughly the same grain, but it does have a different quality because it is not the original wood, and it also doesn't have the patina of wear. The idea is that we have a small dividing line that's in place to kind of show the division between the two, and visually this is not terribly disruptive. But if you're looking for clues, it definitely shows you where the building was added to over time and where changes within the room might have taken place. Now again, this is a very obvious, a very upfront example, but the idea is that you want to respect how the building changed and try to give, again, an authentic representation of the changes in the building over time rather than trying to recreate something that may have never existed. Standard 4. This is the idea that buildings do change over time, and that sometimes those changes become historic in their own right. Sometimes they do not. But in order to understand what is important about a particular building or how it changed over time, you do have to do your homework to determine, was it significant or wasn't it? If it was not significant, you may be able to remove it or to put new modifications in that space that might not be appropriate in areas that have higher historical value. The example that we have here is an 1856 house in Sonoma County. What you're seeing here in red is the area highlighted in red is the original construction of the first floor. Now, this is one of the oldest brick buildings in Sonoma County. So the original configuration is quite telling about how the building functioned, with the primary residence at the front or at the bottom of the image, with a long connector hallway, and then the utilitarian spaces such as the kitchens, which frequently burned down, in the back. Now, over time, the area in yellow was filled in. The owner at the time was a prominent senator. There were several presidents who were entertained at the house in the room that is highlighted in yellow. So this addition, while not part of the original construction, has a historical significance in its own right and therefore is part of the overall construction history that should be interpreted for this building. The areas shown in green are from yet another owner later on, the Pythians. And now the Pythians are actually why the building is listed on the National Register currently. Therefore, their changes and alterations to the house have also acquired a significance. So the building as it stands now is has grown out of these three owners, very, very different owners, each significant in their own right for very different reasons, but they all form part of the construction history for the building. Therefore, in designing a rehabilitation of the building, you have to be cognizant of these changes and of their relative historic status and where modifications would be most appropriate for the new uses that are being accommodated. Standard 5. Pardon me. This is the idea here that, especially in historic buildings, we're looking at a level of craft and quality that generally cannot be obtained today. Not only do they give the building a character and a patina that cannot be replicated at any price, but that these materials are inherently valuable of themselves. And we're seeing more and more today that in the idea of reuse, of sustainability and reusing of materials, which is a great thing, sometimes historic buildings get cannibalized because of the quality of the materials that are in them. But as a unit, they form a very particular part of the story of the building that should be respected. So not only are they difficult to obtain, but the skills needed to put them together and assemble these materials may not be available anymore. Technology has increased quite rapidly over the last 50 years, and a lot of the traditional building skills have changed or have sort of gone out of use, and it may be quite difficult to try to find someone who is knowledgeable enough to be able to work on your building. So if you find someone, make sure that you treat them well and tell all your friends about them. What we're seeing here in this picture is old growth redwood. This is the foyer of a residence, private residence. This is a supposed Albert Farr house, although that has yet to be confirmed. But you can see how all of the materials in this space, this is unfinished old growth redwood. The trim, the doors, the paneling, the floor, you can't see it, but the ceiling, the stairway, everything has this uniform glow about it from the particular quality of the redwood that was used. See, there are absolutely no knots. You cannot get this today. So this is an example that cannot be recreated no matter how much money you had to put on it. And even if you did, the idea is, would this type of detail actually be executed in a building today? Probably not. Therefore, it is part of the building that should be considered part of the value, not only historical value, but also part of the sustainability value of working with these types of materials. So 6, the idea of repair before replace. So not only does it save money in most cases, sometimes it also will save you time. It also allows for the most authentic experience of the space. And generally what happens when you're introducing new materials into a building, whether it's to repair a material that has outgrown its useful life, or you're looking at altering an existing element, the problem is that new materials are often not compatible or not as compatible. They will weather at different rates. They have different levels of moisture retention, and they will respond differently to temperature fluctuations. So what this means is that as the building breathes and expands and responds to the atmosphere, these materials are going to react differently, and that can give you cracking or shifting that may damage some of your finishes, as well as possibly other elements of the house. So the idea is to limit the introduction of new materials as much as possible and to plan for them, to try to get new materials that match the old as closely as possible. The example that we have here of repair before replace are historic windows from a residence in Mendocino County. And what we see on the left-hand side is actually a modified original window. In the 1920s, this is an 1888, circa 1888 farmhouse. And in the 1920s, the owners remodeled And they did not like the arched windows that were there. And you can see the arched header in the brick, and you can see the wooden infill immediately below that. So they actually took the existing windows, cut the top sash, the arch off the top sash, and had the sash refitted with a flat header. When the building was rehabbed, the opposite approach was used. The windows were in excellent condition. There was no reason to put in new windows when the only thing that really needed to be changed was the top rail. So in this case, we did the exact opposite, removed the flat header and put in an arched header. Some modifications to the frame had to be made, but this is the same house. It's not the same window, but same side of the house, where you can see the reconstructed window, which is exactly the same as the original window. And most of this window, over 90% of this window, is original, even though the profile has changed. Now, to actually have these windows remade, reconstructed in their entirety would have been prohibitively expensive for the homeowner, but to just have the top sash modified and new glazing put in was much more effective and was much more cost efficient for them. And not only that, but it reused as much of the historic material as possible. This is a recurring theme. You're going to see this multiple times as we move forward in the other treatments, that the idea of when you actually go through to figure out how to address some of the material deficiencies of the building, you want to refinish something, there are many, many different methods that can be used. And a lot of times people have the best of intentions, but not understanding how materials may react to these different treatments, more damage can be done if they are not aware. So the idea that we have here is this is wood siding that had many, many coats of paint. Most of it, this was a former railroad station, so chances are the paint had quite a lot of high lead content. And the idea was that the owner at the time wanted to go through lead abatement to make the building safe, quote unquote safe, for the new tenant. It was no longer a train station. However, rather than investigating what options may have been available to them, they decided to go with what was a fairly economical choice, and they sandblasted the building. Now, thankfully, this is fairly good quality wood, and it withstood the sandblasting relatively well, but you can see that the surface quality of the siding was dramatically altered. And since this time, they've had to continually repaint the building because it doesn't hold a paint finish as well, and it's also prone to moisture retention. So the idea here is do a little bit of testing up front. Try to figure out what is the most appropriate treatment for your building and the materials involved. Try to find someone that you can rely on who is knowledgeable about the materials, who is knowledgeable about the options that you have available to you, and spend a little bit of time up front getting good advice and doing your testing, because in the end, the treatment that is selected may be less expensive immediately, but it certainly will be less expensive down the road. Because you'll be doing more repairs to the building afterwards, trying to address some of the changes that were inadvertently caused by inappropriate treatments. So here we go with the theme of the archaeological resources. Again, buildings were used continually, or hopefully they were used continually. They were definitely used at different points in time, and therefore there are going to be artifacts that are found. When you're working on a rehabilitation, the idea that archaeology may be involved is a little less of an issue because with the rehabilitation, you're usually not doing too much in the way of subsurface disruption unless you're putting in a new foundation or doing a major addition to the building. This is more of a case when you're getting into areas where you're trying to reconstruct or you're dealing with parts of a building and you're working within an area that was formerly occupied by the building. But just be aware that should you find archaeological resources, you will be required to follow all state, local, and federal laws, and that this is something that they generally look for when looking at historic buildings, just because the chances are higher. All right, so here we're getting to the big one, additions. Now, contextual design is a standard design practice. The idea of working with a historic building is really contextual design with an added layer. You have to consider not only your physical context and your neighborhood context, but the historical context and the different types of evaluation that are necessary to really understand your resource. You have to look at the different features and spaces that are included within the building and understand how they relate to the significance of the building and how they are prioritized. You know, are they very significant? Are they less significant? And then look at general design concepts, just scale, proportion, massing, how people circulated through the building, how they used the building historically, how you plan on using the building in the future, and trying to figure out where there are areas of similar uses and similar expectations, and where are there areas where you really need to do some major modification to help make the new use fit. So if you're following the previous 8 standards, this one should fall into place, although it is one that tends to get a lot more attention than the others, because rehabilitation is the only standard that really allows for new additions and significant alteration. So the case study that we have here is the Palo Alto Medical Facility. Now, this is a former medical clinic that is going to be rehabilitated as a museum. And the idea is that we looked at the different character-defining features and circulation. So what we have here is an office that was used by a doctor, and those were key components to the historical significance of the building. Those particular elements will be retained. The idea that you have this double-loaded corridor where the patients would circulate through the building, again, a character-defining feature and space that is critical to the interpretation of the building, that also will be retained. We have the exterior courtyard. Sorry. One second. Okay, go watch another one. I'm sorry about that. We have the exterior courtyard, which will also be retained, which was a major design feature. Okay, go watch another one. Which was a major design feature of the building. And then we have the new addition, which is shown here at the rear. This is yet to be constructed. Sorry about that. We have the new addition on the back. And this was an area that was previously modified, and it had very few historical finishes left in it. Therefore, we felt that this was an area that could sustain more modification than the front areas of the building, which is where you see the double-loaded corridor. So again, it's understanding not only how these spaces were used, but how they were important to the overall design as well as to the function of the building, and what was the actual amount of fabric and the integrity of the building that was left, and then prioritizing where changes would go based on the most appropriate areas within the building that could accommodate changes. So areas that were already modified, that's where most of the modifications went, the new modifications. This is a fairly simplistic example, but I think you get the idea that you really have to have a firm understanding of how your building is historic, how it functions, and how that tends to relate to what are the new functions that you plan on putting into the building. And trying to find, again, synergies that where those uses are compatible, and areas where they may not be compatible, trying to figure out what compromises can be made, where alterations can be made to the historic fabric, but you still retain the essential character of the building, or why the building is historically significant. All right, and finally, the idea of reversibility. Now, reversibility is a philosophical concept that should always be strived for. However, it is a difficult concept to really to take in a purist form. Any modification you're going to be doing to a building, to remove it is going to have an impact. So the idea that the work that you're doing can be purely reversible is really unrealistic. But what you want to try to do is look for as much reversibility as possible within the project. you really want to get a sense of understanding what are the essential components of the building, again, and where can you place modifications that don't alter that significant form. Looking at areas that have less integrity, so if they were modified in the past, you can put things there, and therefore when your addition or your modifications are removed in the future, you really have not harmed or touched the areas of the building that are historically significant. The example that we have right here is this is a space, it's a large open space in a former schoolhouse, and they needed to have office space within the building. But the idea of putting in full-height partitions into this large space would have been extremely damaging to the historical character of the schoolhouse. So the solution that was made were these relatively low-height partitions with a semi-transparent finish. The idea is that light could flow through, there was still a sense of space, and that there was actually still a visual connection from various points in the room. You're far enough away and being able to see over these that, again, you weren't impacting the essential form of the space. But in the future, if they decide that they no longer need this office space or they need more office space, these partitions can be easily modified without harming the existing historic fabric. All right, so now that we've gone through rehabilitation, we're going to go through the other three treatments in a little bit quicker form. And I think you'll start to see that there is, again, a lot of repetition, and that there is quite a few areas where the same principle is being applied. It's just that the language may be nuanced slightly. So preservation. The idea with preservation is it generally applies to buildings that are not looking to change the use. You're not looking to alter the appearance, and you're really not looking to modify the layout of the building. Dealing with issues of deferred maintenance, that might be considered preservation. You're not really looking at upgrading the building. You're looking at possibly stabilizing it if the building's in a really decrepit state. Or you're looking at simply mothballing the building while you figure out what additional work may be warranted. So again, with preservation, you're really not looking at putting in many new uses. The types of new uses that might be considered are very limited. You'd have to look at something that was traditionally in the building, so returning the building to its original use or a historical use, or perhaps looking at turning it more into an interpretive type use where the building is not being used for a specific function, but more as a historic artifact. In this case, again, you're really looking at addressing any of the maintenance issues that may have been deferred over time and trying to buy more time while planning is taking place. As we see with rehabilitation, you also, again, want to respect the character of the building. You want to know its construction history as well as its actual history, the context for its history. Knowing what its maintenance history is also quite helpful because that way you can understand what changes occurred over time. The idea here is that you really also want to, just like with rehabilitation, you want to prioritize the features and spaces so that you can prioritize your work. If you understand what areas are most significant historically and you have limited funds, those are the areas that you're probably going to want to focus your money. Also, if you have areas that are in particular need of attention, structural issues, foundation issues, leaky roofs, that sort of thing, again, understanding what the building needs and what its historical significance is to try to get the most bang for your buck is very important, especially under preservation because the work is usually so limited. And keep in mind that sometimes the nature of the repairs can be quite unconventional. The idea of the project that's being shown here, this is Jackson Pollock's studio on Long Island, and the idea that this building, the studio had a tremendous amount of rot in the floor. But the goal of the project was to preserve the studio in its existing state with its existing materials so that people could experience the space exactly as Jackson Pollock used it. And to remove the floor or to somehow alter these floorboards would have been extremely detrimental to the character of the building and to its historical significance. So the solution that was devised here, again, preservation, addressing a very specific material failure, was that the areas of really bad wear, and you can see where the wood-boring insects have gotten in and really done havoc with the floorboards. The surface was very carefully removed. This area was filled with an appropriate cellulose filler, and then that area was reapplied, and then reversible water paints were used to fill it in. So if you look very carefully at the area on the right, you can see the small area of repair. So when standing back and looking at it, you do not see the repair, but the maximum amount of material was saved. This is considered a preservation treatment. There were no new materials or interventions that were introduced. Okay, starting to see repetition here. You need to understand how the building changed over time, and you also want to be able to communicate your changes over time as well. The idea is that repair should be sensitive to retain as much historic fabric. You want to have as much documentation as possible to try to differentiate the old material from the new material. Some methods that have been used are date stamping new wood elements so that they can be blended quite seamlessly as a finish, but should they be removed in the future, the date stamp would be there to show, oh, this was not an original element. The idea of using faux finishes to approximate existing finishes, or slight differences in color, grain, texture, those sort of qualities are all ways to have to be able to see the new work versus the old work. And paper documentation is great. You should do it. It should be in drawings and photographs, but understand that once the project is finished, that documentation often gets lost. So it's a good idea to try to build in as much of this differentiation as possible to your project. This is an example of preservation projects where original material, again, was used. There was clear documentation as to what happened before and after, and you can see that the repairs look fairly minor, even though there was quite a bit of documentation that had to go into devising what those repairs might be. But you can also see where even after it was repaired, you can still see where the cracks were. There's a slight difference in color in the bricks where new bricks were introduced. And you can also, but the idea is that the existing material was retained, so you still get the color differentiation from all the rising damp, although it is not quite as bright because now you actually have mortar in those joints instead of just bricks falling out. Okay, standard 4, knowing how your building changed and how those changes can be significant. Again, we covered this in rehabilitation. In preservation, it's even more important because generally you're trying to interpret a building into, as a particular place and time. You don't want to remove anything unnecessarily, even in the name of treatment. So the idea is really understand how your building evolved, how those changes are appropriate, and trying to maintain as much of that as possible while further plans are developed. All right. Looking at features and finishes and preservation, again, you're trying to limit the amount of work that you're doing, and therefore you really want to retain as much of this as possible. Recognize that changes in technology have changed materials and they have changed techniques. And therefore, when you're looking at preserving a building, you really want to retain as much of that as possible because those construction techniques sometimes become why the building is important or an added layer of significance for the building. If these techniques are no longer used or that material is no longer found, that is an added element of historical significance that should not be removed and should be retained under preservation or under any of the treatments. Okay, so standard 6 under preservation is really about not making any quick decisions. You need to evaluate the material that you're looking at, evaluate its historical significance, and go to professionals when you have doubts. The proper treatment will improve your building, and the improper treatment could cause greater damage. And the example we have here is where an improper mortar was used to repair the bricks, and the mortar was too hard, no testing was done, and what we're seeing here is the bricks are actually starting to fail instead of the mortar. And so now you have a historic material that you can no longer get that is being lost because of an improper treatment, an improper level of intervention at the wrong time. So again, more repetition. We're really getting into the chemical treatments and archaeology. These are the exact same as rehabilitation. The idea is that you start gentle with determining what your treatments are going to be and get more aggressive only after testing. And that you should be prepared to find archaeological remains of some sort, and that may not happen, but as long as you're prepared, you generally have yourself covered. All right, so very quickly, we're going to start moving into restoration. Restoration, as it applies, or as it sounds, is returning a building to a particular point in time. So what we're looking at here is, sorry, I'm getting my notes together. What we're looking at here is Montpelier, which was the former home of President Madison, and then it was also owned by the DuPont family for quite a period of time. Now, recently, the National Trust has restored this building back to its appearance during President Madison's inhabitation. What we have on the top is the DuPont era house. What we have at the bottom is the restored Madison era house. You can see that quite a bit of structure was removed. Restoration does allow for removal of historic features for the purposes of interpreting a building to a particular point in time. So restoration has the most restrictions on use. You really have to have a historic use that is going to be put back in the building because, again, you are trying to represent the building at a particular period of time, and therefore that use should reflect that particular period in time. Close related use could be some sort of interpretive value, again, a house museum. The building was not originally a museum but can function as a museum because you're using it as an education tool to help illustrate an event or a person or a particular period in time. So your documentation has to be absolutely spot on. Okay. Standard 2 under restoration. Again, you really have to have the documentation. Features can be removed and some elements may be recreated, but you have to have solid evidence to support your decision. You also have to be clear about what particular period is being interpreted. A confusion of periods is not encouraged because it doesn't give an authentic representation of the evolution of the building over time. However, if you do it correctly, you can mix periods within a particular building. The example we have here is the Meek Mansion in Hayward. Now, this building was owned by the same family over a very lengthy period of time, and there were quite a few changes to the building over that time. So if you enter the building, certain rooms are interpreted to certain periods, and then as you progress through the building, you are seeing an evolution of the house over time as each room takes on a different period for its interpretation. All right, again, we're looking at an authentic experience here. And under restoration, it is appropriate to use the material for perhaps not its original function. The idea is that you may have structural members or some sort of aesthetic character that had a particular function in the past but may no longer have that function. You know, it could be a call box for servants, or perhaps it's a structural beam that has been cracked. The idea is retain as much of that fabric as possible and use it to dress the new intervention. The call box could remain, perhaps it's just a decorative feature. The beam could be used to hide, it could be hollowed out and used to hide a new steel member, perhaps. and some of these may get unconventional, but again, you want to document what these changes are, try to use as much of the original material as possible, and also document where you have gotten any new material that is going to be introduced. Standard 4. Have you gotten the idea here? You need to document, 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 especially with restoration, because it does involve removal of elements that may have a historical value in and of themselves. The idea here is we have partitions that were removed to facilitate preservation of a building. We do not know the function of the partitions nor their historical values, so they were all very carefully labeled and photographed before dismantling, and then to enable their reconstruction at a later date if possible. The idea is that you, again, if you're going to remove something, you need to be able to know where did it go, what was its function, and if I had to put it back, could I put it back? And then all this documentation should be kept in one place. The HSR is a good example or a good place to keep it if you have one. If not, a central file that is well organized. And also make many, many copies, because over time this documentation does get lost. Okay, we're going to start doubling up here. Again, distinctive features. I think we've gotten the idea that the items from the period of interpretation have a higher historical value and therefore should be retained and protected very, very carefully while work is undergoing. But also have a plan for how you're going to protect them before you start. Make sure that plan is implemented during construction, and make sure that you have a plan for what to do with the excess material afterwards. Deteriorated features, they should be repaired. Again, repair before replace. We're looking for an authentic experience, particularly with restoration, because you are representing it as this building in this period of time. You have to be able to distinguish what is original and what is not. And this is the idea where there's really very little gray area under restoration. You really should look at matching it exactly and documenting, or having it be very clearly modern so that there really is no confusion as to what the origins of these particular features may be. Now, when you're working under restoration, there is a certain amount of changes to the building, obviously, that you're going to be doing, and you should not look at introducing elements from other buildings into the building unless you have very clear documentation that this was a match for what was there originally. Generally, if you can't prove that it was there, then you really should not try to reintroduce it. You must be able to clearly justify why you are making these design decisions. Okay. And again, here we get into treatments, archaeology, and I think we're getting the idea here. And again, don't make it up. Avoid conjecture. If this did not exist historically, then it should not exist during the restoration, because you would be creating a false sense of development. All right, hang in there. We are almost done. Reconstruction. Now, reconstruction is, again, we keep striving or stressing the idea of documentation. However, reconstruction is really documentation heavy. I mean, you are looking at not only representing a particular period in time, but you're trying to do so with all new materials. The idea here is that rarely is it a whole building. What you're seeing here is Sutter's Fort in Sacramento, which really is almost entirely a reconstruction. Only the central building where you see the flagpole, that is the only original element within this entire building. All of the rest of it reconstructed. This is an example, a very extreme example. Most of the time, it's just a portion of a building that you're looking at reconstructing. And you should understand that the changes that are made and the elements that are reconstructed are not necessarily historic. However, over time, they could become historic. So they are not assumed to be historic immediately after construction, but they may acquire a historical significance on their own. Sutter's Fort is an example where, even though this is a reconstruction, it was done very early, and it was done very early in the preservation movement. And therefore, as an example of early preservation, this is a historically significant building, not because it's Sutter's Fort, but because of the reasons and methodology that were used to determine how it was to be reconstructed. Okay, reconstruction should rely very heavily on physical evidence. This example is pretty straightforward, where you can actually see the ghosting of a former staircase on the siding. So reconstructing, knowing its location, knowing its profile, there were photographs that went along with this, as well as oral histories that informed sort of how the staircase flowed through the space. But there was very, very clear documentation within the historic fabric and within the related historical documentation to inform reconstruction of this particular element. So again, this is an idea of where it's a part of a building, and that's more common than the entire building. When you're looking at doing reconstruction, there's a certain amount of investigation that has to go on. Archaeological investigation is quite helpful. You want to look at what remains, look for the various clues. You may be looking for things such as fragments of building materials, traces of building elements, where there were missing pieces, where there might be pieces that have fallen by the wayside. Historic archaeology is particularly important here, but depending on the nature of your site, you might want to look at industrial archaeology, if it's a commercial or a manufacturing site. And you might be looking for things like footing locations, size of framing members, foundations, as well as the individual artifacts that may have been associated with use in the building. Here's an example of photographic documentation that was used for reconstruction of portions of Sutter's Fort. And as you can see, they have pretty strong documentation to support how this building was repaired and how elements of it were reconstructed. Because you're working with such little historic material, what you do have becomes extremely important and extremely valuable. So again, you want to preserve whatever you have becomes that much more important. And sometimes it helps to know what you need to look for in order to know what you're looking for to help you find what you need. It sounds sort of counterintuitive, but if you're looking at examples from the same period, other buildings that are similar in time, you may get a better sense of what are the type of things that you should be looking at in your building. And also know your limitations. Sometimes you just can't find it, and you should be able to move on or be prepared to try to deal with that. Okay, so again, accurate depiction, looking at more documentation. This is an example of the Redwood City, the San Mateo Courthouse, an original photograph. This was changed. They used the photograph as well as other documentation to support reconstruction of the portico and the columns. So again, have your documentation handy. If nothing else, you'll know that having the references will help you inform any modern interpretations that you may have to use. Again, avoid conjecture. Make sure that you're clearly representing the origins and the time period. And also, even reconstructing, make sure you're reconstructing it as it was historically, not as it might have been. All right, thanks for sticking with us. We're just about done here. So a recap of this basic philosophical framework. Okay, the standards are actually 4 treatments, and each of those treatments has its own set of standards. There's a different number for each treatment, and there are associated guidelines that go with them. Understand your resource, understand why it's significant, understand how it evolved over time, and use that as the basis for your planning. Repair before replaced, you want to use the maximum amount of historic material if possible. Part of that is using the gentlest means possible when trying to address your resource. The idea that a treatment can be, a design solution can be compatible and differentiated, that they don't have to be mutually exclusive, and that they don't have to be the extreme. They don't have to match exactly, and they don't have to be wildly different. that usually the most successful design solutions come in somewhere in the middle. Don't make it up. Make sure you have firm documentation. And again, be aware for archaeological finds and protection of those should they be found. Okay, and with that, thank you for sticking with us, and I believe we will open it up to questions.
Yes, thank you, Becky. That certainly was a lot to cover in 1 hour. But if anybody has any other questions, feel free to either send us a question in the question box or the chat. What I will do is leave the question time open for a little bit. So if we don't get a chance for everybody to answer questions or ask questions, we can get back to them later. But one of the questions that did come up is, what is meant by the bullet point on the side for the first standard under Reconstruction, which referred to Reconstruction, not historic?
The reconstructed elements or building is not a historic resource. It may represent a historic resource, but just because it has been recreated does not necessarily make it historic. It's the idea that it is a picture of a masterpiece, not necessarily the masterpiece itself. There may be elements of it that are original and do have historical significance. The reconstruction over time may become historic, but the reconstruction itself is not the historic building. Okay? It is a representation of the historic building.
There was also another question. This is more of a clarification. A handout was sent to you earlier, and that is more for your background. But this presentation will be PDF'd, and a link will be sent to you, so everybody will have a copy of this presentation as well as the handout from yesterday. And let's see. I see another question that we did have was, let's see. Documentation is often limited. Is there a point when you can proceed even if you don't have the answers you need via pictures, etc.?
Yes, and I think that that's going to vary by project. It's going to vary by the work that you're planning on doing, as well as the nature of the resource. We rarely will get the amount of documentation or the answers that we would really like to have, and so you do have to make some informed guesses and be able to back up those choices. You're not always going to have concrete answers, but you need to be able to justify the reasonings for particular design solutions. And yes, you could research something to death. You could spend years researching. So there definitely has to be a stopping point. And again, understanding general uses of the building, or at least what you're planning on putting into the building and what those impacts might be on the building. Prioritizing what you do know about the building and using that as the basis for helping to determine where modifications should go, how drastic those modifications really need to be. And again, keeping in mind the general tenets: repair before replace, gentlest means possible, get as much information as you can. Trying to follow those to really understand your resource will generally put you in a good place for having a compatible design, because you will not ever have all of the answers.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. One is, what do you suggest for dealing with downgraded asbestos roof of historic structures?
So, first question is, was the asbestos roof historic? Maybe. They were installed quite early. We've seen them as early as the 1920s, in which case you can get replicas of that particular material, same profile, but not necessarily, it'd be a modern material. If it's not historic, then you may be looking at removing it and trying to figure out what was the original roofing and what is a modern roofing that would give you similar design characteristics. So if it were a shingle roof, you might be looking at a modern asphalt shingle that gives you a similar color or has a similar overlap. I mean, we're not looking at replicating materials exactly, but trying to get the essence of what that material was or what that design was, and trying to find a modern equivalent that is compatible with that approximates it. Generally, the roof is not why the building is historic. It is just an added feature that contributes to the interpretation of the building, but you'd be looking at more approximating it in modern materials.
Okay. Unfortunately, I think we're going to stop right now, but we do have a couple of more questions. But what I'm going to ask Becky to do is, after this call, if she could answer them in writing, and then we'll send those questions out to everybody. And just in case there's more questions, I will leave the webinar up for a bit longer so you can ask your questions, and then we will get those answered for you. And again, I will be passing out a copy of this presentation as well as a link to the recording of the webinar. I will also be sending out an evaluation form. But now I'd like to thank Becky for giving an excellent presentation on the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. So thank you, Becky. And thank all of you for joining us, and I hope you're able to join us at another webinar soon. Thank you. Bye.